Okay, very well.
Okay, thank you. Um, Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever it is in your part of the world. I'm really happy to be here again this year. And so many thanks to the organizers, especially Kelly, for making this happen. I really enjoy this gathering of tree ring scientists from around the world. What I'm going to talk about today is how we can maybe better test forest dynamics theory and closed canopy forests in ways that takes advantage of the strength of dendrochronology, the precision of cross dating, and to honor those hard efforts, as we just heard about, in terms of cross dating trees. Before I get into the excuse me, before I get into the data, I want to give thanks and acknowledge the thousands of trees that I've learned from. Excuse me for a second. Okay. Over my career, I've been lucky to learn from thousands and thousands of trees. From the many people that have helped me during my dissertation and since then, collecting data, processing data, analyzing data, interpreting data, and then the many agencies that have helped fund my research over time. None of this really would be possible without them. In the last 2 to 3 years, actually it's 3 to 5 years now, I've been working with this wonderful team, too many people to name to save time. But I just want to say this has been a great group to work with. We've been working on two projects, mostly studying old growth forests across the Northeastern United States, which is what I'm going to present on today, but also in four different national forests within the United States. So we've been thinking about old trees, old forests, forest development, and disturbance quite intensely for the last, yeah, since about 2022. And the place in the context for today and why this is important, I think, is we are seeing the very significant impacts of global ecological change around the world. I like to point to the semi-arid forests because this has been happening for 2.5 decades or so now, where we've seen an increase in the intensity, frequency, and scale of forest fires, pine beetle outbreaks killing trees, and a mega drought that is killing uh, some species over others in the southwestern United States. The impact of global ecological change is being expressed in many of our forests around the world. But the western United States, especially the southwestern United States, is really is has been in it, so to speak, for about 20 years now. When we go, however, into the paleoecological literature that goes back research that covers the last 300 to 1,000 years or so, these changes in our forests in the western United States and these type of disturbances are not too surprising. What probably has changed is again the frequency, intensity, and spatial scale of these disturbances, but the drivers and the mechanisms of forest change and forest development over time are pretty well understood. I'm going to say relatively. There's always more to learn. But I live in and I'm fascinated by the temperate mesic forests like those in East Asia and those here in the eastern United States. And I would argue that our understanding of how our forests might change in the future is not as clear yet. These are muddier forests, so to speak. They're harder to understand because of the diversity and I think because of the climate. So, a theoretical underpinning of forest change over time in these forest types is that is that development is largely driven by small scale dynamics or gap dynamics. You know, the mortality of trees asynchronously in time, asynchronously in space of 1 to 2% of the forest each year. And so while we have larger scale disturbances and more intense disturbances, like this is the impact of Superstorm Sandy outside of New York City, you'll see that most of the trees survived this large, strong windstorm. And I would also argue that the scale of impact of hurricanes, ice storms, windstorms, snowstorms, things that kill our trees quite often, naturally, natural dynamics in the eastern United States do not scale spatially like the ones we see in the western United States, like in boreal forests, and as drought could be expressed over space. And so, our understanding, our theoretical underpinning, and what we've observed in the last 50 to 100 years in the eastern United States is that broad scale change might be low with climatic change as we move into the future. There are models that suggest that we could get significant change in our forest over the next 20 to 50 years, but there's almost an equal likelihood that the forest won't change too much in terms of climate change and natural disturbances. This low amount in change is called the mechanism for this low amount of change is called dynamic equilibrium. So it's the asynchronous mortality of trees in time and space as expressed at broader spatial scales suggests that these forests won't change much, that there isn't abrupt change. And so tree rings have actually been really central to this idea in understanding long-term forest dynamics. Um, the results that we've gotten in the last 50 years give some gravity or some credibility to this dynamic equilibrium concept. And so I'm not going to call out any scientists or any specific study, but here's one from about several decades ago. And in the early part of this record back here, it's a periodic disturbance, but I think that's sample replication. This is only one forest as well. But starting at around 1850, going to about 1960, you can see there was rather continuous disturbance, the trees showing a growth release or a canopy disturbance on the y-axis is pretty consistent. The abrupt increase in the 20s and 30s is actually an exotic pest and pathogen, probably killing off the American chestnut. And so I think this is partly due our conception of dynamic equilibrium from tree ring analysis is related to decadal binning or putting these disturbances in 10-year periods, as you see in this paper. Now, decadal binning has value because it includes the ecological lags of if there's a disturbance event, when do the trees die, and the trees that survive, when do they recover and become prominent trees back in the forest? That might not happen immediately. There might be a 1 or 2 or 3 or more year lag. So decadal binning kind of captures that ecological lag. As someone who's worked in dendroclimatology, reconstructing climate, though, we want to have the most precise, clear signals with great fidelity to reconstruct climate. And what I'm going to argue here for is that by using decadal binning, we might be smearing the signal of forest dynamics, despite its value. So, about 12 years ago now, we have our first publication where we used annual binning. I'm not going to go over the results here. You can see there are sharper peaks in terms of the percent trees disturbed or showing disturbance through time. There are low periods with very little disturbance. I think that's really important. But as a tree ring scientist, I felt it was really important if we have annual cross dating and we put great efforts to cross date, we should honor that. We should reflect that in the data. And so I felt very strongly that we should use annual binning. And this is the result that we get from those efforts in terms of binning the data differently. And so what I'm going to present for the rest of my talk is basically a gathering, a coalescing of thoughts that have developed over the last decade or so, maybe 15 years, and thinking about forest dynamics, how they and how forests develop over time, disturbance ecological theory, as I would put it. So I won't really have strong conclusions. I might present some conclusions, but this is all very, very, very preliminary. What I want to talk about is methodology and approach. So what I'm going to be working through with you during this talk are the various tweaks that we're working on in terms of methodology as we work through a large-scale project to study old growth forests in the northeastern United States. And so much thanks to the National Science Foundation for funding this project. We have about 25 to 30 sites across the northeastern United States. And what I'm going to focus on just for the rest of this talk is specifically this area right here in the blue circle and the blue oval. This is the Adirondack State Park. Um, I know there are many lovely parts of the world. We all have our favorite places, and I've been lucky to see some of them, like in Bhutan and so on and so forth. Um, I think the Adirondack State Park is quite a gem. It's 2.4 million hectares of state preserve in the New York State Constitution. Half of it's private, roughly half of it's public. And so there's a lot of restrictions and preservation of nature in this system, in this state park. It's one of the largest state parks, if not the largest state park in the lower 48 states in the United States. I want to also give thanks and acknowledge the many different organizations that have given us permission to sample in these wonderful old growth forests across the Northeastern United States. And so, we're partly in this science because we love going into the forest. So I want to take you to a short field trip through several of the forests that we sampled as a part of this project. This is a site that we call Gold Mine. It's a mixed northern hardwood forest, so Acer, Betula, Fagus, Patsia, and Suga are the dominant species. The big tree on the left is a 200, I think it's about 200-year-old Betula eleganthiensis. It might be older, but many of these trees ended up being hollow. Betula really hollows when it gets larger in the northeastern United States. This is Chase Van Esker. It's a Pinus resinosa forest. These trees were 200 to 300 years old. Fire is very important to these ecosystems. This is Mosier Reservoir. It is almost a pure northern hardwood forest, so Acer, Betula, Fagus. It might not look old growth because we have exotic pests and pathogens that are killing off the fagus. But within this forest, the sugar maple are quite old for the species, 250 to 310 years old. And in this picture, there's a 408-year-old Betula eleganthiensis. It's probably older than that, but it was partly hollow. This is one of our favorite forests, and I just had to show some pictures of autumn in the northeastern United States. This is Dr. Dave Orwig, a co-PI on this project at Pollywog Pond. We didn't sample these large Tsuga canadensis, but they were 200 to 300 years old, most likely. And this is Moss Lake down in the southwestern Adirondacks. These wonderful trees were cored by Ed Cook in the 1970s. We updated the chronology and we put in some plots. These Pinus strobus are 250 to 325 years old. So we are working in a range of forest types with a large range of ages, though I'm just showing you some of the older ages that we found. So I want to introduce the Adirondack State Park geographically because I don't want you to get the impression that this is a homogeneous landscape. Again, this is 2.4 million hectares within that blue line that I drew, very ugly blue line that I drew. And this is the elevation. This is the topography in the northeastern New York State. Average elevation is 371 meters. The maximum is 1650. That yellow dot shows roughly where that is. And the blue dot shows that the minimum elevation in the Adirondacks on the northeast corner is only about 61 meters above sea level. It's a very cool part of the New York State. It's a great place to go in the summer, though it's getting hotter like it is everywhere else. The warmest place is in the northeastern part of the Adirondacks, where its average annual temperature is 6.1 C. The coolest part is in the central part and in the high mountains. And the lowest temperature is roughly, on average, the average annual temperature is 1.7 C. What's really interesting and important about the ecology and this region is the great precipitation gradient across 2.4 million hectares. The wettest part within the Adirondack State Park averages about 1,500 millimeters per year, and that happens in the southern southwestern part of the park. The driest part, again, is up in the northeast corner of the park, 950 millimeters of rain, which is still a lot to some parts of the world, but that's relatively dry for us here in the northeastern United States. Not super dry, but relatively. But there is a rain shadow effect from the mountains in this region, and the northeastern part of the park and the eastern part of the park is drier than the western part of the park. And it's winter here, and I love snow, so I just had to show you this. Within the park, in the southwest corner, the average annual snowfall is 4.5 meters. Right now, that pink area is getting about 3 meters this week of snow, so they're gonna be well above average this year. And again, the lowest amount of snow cover or snowfall is in the northeast part of the park at 1.7 meters per year. So it's really snowy. It's a wonderful time to visit in the winter if you love winter, and I love winter. So. Here's our network of old growth forests in the Adirondacks. We sampled 12 forests. We only worked up 9 of these forests because the other 3 were highly disturbed by exotic pests and pathogens or a big fire about 80 to 100 years ago. We have a roughly 1,300 growth series, and we have 700 to 900 trees. We're still finalizing our data there that we have processed. We sampled 13 different tree species, so this really isn't one of the more diverse parts of the Eastern United States, but I was really surprised we sampled 13 tree species. The oldest tree dates to 1572. The oldest sugar maple, Acer saccharum, is 348 years old, which is really old for the species. And again, the oldest Betula eleganthiensis, yellow birch, is 408. I want to focus again a little bit on the fall foliage, but really that we mostly sampled mixed northern hardwood forests. And this is important to our hypothesis because the the half century theory of how these forests develop over time is a cyclical succession. So it never really changes. It just cycles slowly between 3 main species over decades and centuries. And so we sampled in forests that would more easily disprove our hypothesis. And I really encourage your science to do that. Make the tests that you're going after, make them hard to support. Choose a system that might not support your hypothesis, because if it happens there, maybe then it's real. That's yeah, yeah, I'll just go there. Okay. So let's walk through some of the methodologies that we're talking about, how we reconstruct forest development and disturbance ecology over time. We go back to the old saying, if a tree falls in the wood and there's no one there to see it, does it actually occur? I know I'm riffing on that one. And as tree ring scientists, I know you know this, that we know that if a tree falls over, the surrounding trees record that disturbance. And so I want to specifically talk about the 1938 hurricane in the northeastern United States, September 1938. It knocked down a lot of forests up through the central part of New England. And in this particular forest, it was old growth up until 1938. Well, it still is old growth today, but it was a stand composed of old Pinus strobus and Suga canadensis, 200 and 300-year-old trees. 80% were knocked down in a single windstorm. And so this is the physical expression of a surviving Suga canadensis in that very same forest. Here it reached coring height in around 1873, and for the first 67 years of its life, it grew very slowly. It was growing in the understory. The 38 hurricane comes down, knocks down about 80% of the canopy, and in the equal amount of radial growth of the first 67 years, it's equaled in the following 6 years after the hurricane. So this was really a significant disturbance event. We can identify that visually, but we can quantify that also in looking at percent change in growth, immediate percent change in growth, so we can quantify it statistically, and we can create and we can reconstruct a disturbance history, a canopy disturbance history of the forest through growth releases over time. And so, coming back to the 1938 hurricane event, I want to walk you through what we found. And so here's the forest. Just under 80 years later, it recovered really nicely. The tree on the right with Danny Bishop there is a Pinus strobus that dates to the 1660s. So some trees survived, like this pine tree here, but the forest recovered quite nicely after the very impactful hurricane. And so here is a time series of canopy disturbance. Growth averaging method doesn't matter, but growth releases or canopy inferred canopy disturbance. Here's the 1938 hurricane right here. And here's the data that as it is binned using decadal blocks of time. So the 1930s, the golden bar right here shows that there was a lot of disturbance. And that works perfectly because we know that the canopy was blown over in 1938. Using decadal binning, we see that the biggest decade of disturbance happened in 1938, and then it was just average. It reached an average in the following decades. But when we remove these blocks and we see annual binning, we see something a little bit better, I would say, and a little bit more important. There is a spike of disturbance right here right before 1940. Some of it occurs before the hurricane, so the trees are not anticipating the hurricane. This is just statistical noise in the detection of canopy disturbance, it's something we need to work on. And there is disturbance after 1938. Trees are showing growth releases following it. This is the ecological lag that I mentioned earlier in this talk. To me, very importantly, though, there is very little disturbance at the end of the 20s and into the 1930s in this forest, and there's very little disturbance after about 1945 until we get out here to the 60s and 70s. And so decadal scale binning blocks that information, that temporal precision that we can get through cross dating. Okay? All right. So now I forgot to label this slide. This is the disturbance history from all of our sites in the Adirondack State Park, our modern project today. And this is the 10-year binning, the decadal binning that is tradition in our tree ring ecological research. And we're going to ignore the data before about 1700 because, as you can see, tree replication is quite low. And after starting about 1740, disturbance is fairly constant each decade. There's a lot of disturbance each decade with some peaks and some valleys of disturbance, but what it looks like is constant disturbance, just like what we saw in that study from about 50 years ago. When we move to 5-year binning, we get a decrease in the percentage of trees released on the y-axis versus decadal binning because we're getting more precise with our disturbance reconstruction. But if we focus on this period, which we're going to focus on for the next few slides, around 1800 to 1850, you see spikes of disturbance, a reduction in disturbance, and another spike of disturbance. And so the signal there is real and it's preserved. Here's 2-year binning that Dario Martin Benito thought we should look at, and he's starting to win me over that I think 2-year binning might be good enough for our purposes here. And again, the spikes around 1800 and around the 1850s are still there. The signal is robust no matter how we bin it. And here's annual binning, which is the one I prefer in ways. And again, the spikes are still there, low period of disturbance, and another spike around 1850. And so this structure of disturbance, if we just focus on that period, is robust. It is real across the Adirondack State Park. But this is, but what I want to show you first is that our average frequency of disturbance from 1700 to the present in this blue line is 1.9%. That's almost exactly is what's predicted by observations in the eastern United States since about the 1970s. So we are reconstructing a very realistic history of disturbance through time. The orange dashed lines are one and are +1 and -1 standard deviations of the mean, and we have these spikes that are significant and might not be predicted by ecological theory in these forests. And so while I'm talking about disturbance, and disturbance ecology has been a part of my life for 30 years or more, I'm getting fascinated by these periods that I'm calling quiescence. I don't know why I'm settling on this term quiescence, but I am. But what I'm talking about are quiet periods of low disturbance. So this red bar right here between 1820 and 1840 essentially is a quiet period of disturbance. And you can see it's about 30 years between 1810, 1840, where there's very little disturbance. When we go to the 1 year binning and we look at that period more closely, the length of the red bar is retained from the decadal binning. But when we look at the turquoise bar, which is the time period of quiescence, uh, based on the annual bidding, depending on how you define it, it is about 40% longer. This is temporally more precise. This honors the efforts of cross-dating sugar maple, yellow birch, and all the diffuse porous species that we have to deal with. Now, how we define a period of quiescence or quiet in the forest is still up for debate. We're working on this. This is a methodology. Maybe we only say this period is quiescent and then this period's quiescent, or maybe it's only this period to this period, or it's this period to this period. Either way, we are showing a longer period of quiet and important spikes, punctuated spikes of disturbance, which is different than what the theory would predict. So that's one thing we're doing to tweak the methodology. The second thing is something Vova Troutsuk did in this 2018 paper for us, is he developed a kernel density function that reflects the spikes and troughs of disturbance, again, for the 1938 hurricane. So this kernel density function that he created almost perfectly captures the peak of disturbance with the 1938 hurricane and shows low periods of disturbance, quiescence before and after that period. And it captures the uncertainty due to statistical noise, and it captures the uncertainty due to ecological lag. So this is the second methodology that we're tweaking to try to understand the disturbance of these forests and maybe to do better attribution of the drivers of disturbance in these forests. So now Dario Martin Benito is taking it to another level, and this is a really complicated figure, but basically these are the 9 sites. Each line is one of the 9 sites within the Adirondack State Park. And right now it looks like a spaghetti plot. These are smooth kernel density functions of reconstructed disturbance history in the Adirondacks, across the Adirondacks. However, when you look at these a little closer, there are periods that I would suggest look like, but we don't know, we got to quantify, but look like synchronized disturbance. In the early 1700s, late 1700s is a short period where look at the white spaces below these curves. There are white spaces that suggest that there is synchronization in the disturbance cycles. Here's another one in the mid 1800s that we've been talking about, and here's another one in the early 1900s. The opposite of that, of course, are these periods of quiescence. And I would like to argue that there are synchronized quiescence in these very preliminary data that need a lot of further statistical analysis, not just visual interpretation. But again, early 1700s, there's low disturbance across all our plots. Here's another one in the mid to late 1900s. And here's that one that we've been focusing on in the early 1800s, with exceptions of with the exception of two populations where there might be elevated disturbance, but they're the exception to the rule in the Adirondacks. So our next step that I'm not showing, but Dario has started on, that we're going to work on, is to do a spatial quantification. Is there clustering in time and space of disturbance in the Adirondacks? And where is this and why might it happen? So that's the next steps of this project. And so to start to wrap up my talk, um, we see periods of asynchronous and synchronous disturbance, but whether these forests have synchronous disturbance is important because it suggests something about climatic vulnerability. If there are if there are periods of synchronous disturbance at large spatial scales, the driver could be climate, could be drought, and that would suggest that our forests actually might be more vulnerable to climate than we might think. It also suggests that maybe there are large-scale disturbances in the past that we haven't seen recently, in the modern era. So there's a lot to learn about these synchronous eras of disturbance and quiescence. And what I didn't focus on is that there is a period of synchronous disturbance in the 1970s and 1980s that is being brought on by exotic pests and pathogens. So exotic pests and pathogens are actually making this question I have on this natural disturbance in theory almost moot. Yeah, almost mute. Moot. I'm sorry. The thing we have to keep in mind as a tree ring, as people that use temporal time series, is this all could be temporal coincidence. This could be correlation and not actually causation. So we need to keep this in mind as we analyze our data. The theoretical outcomes, as I suggested already, is if there are aperiodic, large-scale synchronous events, that maybe these forests are more climatically vulnerable. Um, if this turns out to be true, and there's a lot of if before we get there, maybe we need to refine disturbance and developmental theory for temperate mesic forests, but we need more testing. I can't emphasize how much more testing and methodological development we need to be able to understand these data better. Um, but broadly, what I'm trying to talk to you about today is we need to continue to tweak our methodologies, whether it's binning, whether it's kernel density function, testing for synchronicity with smooth time series in time and space. This is quite a challenge for our science, I think, but we have a group that will be able to do that. And, it's really that what I really want a lot of us to think more often is science is baby steps, small steps of progression, and then an explosion of advancement. But it might be a decade or two or three sometimes of small steps before we see the better picture. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nail, for this interesting topic, for this outstanding keynote on testing forest dynamics theory in closed-canopy forest, and for highlighting this the importance of cross-dating efforts.